The smell of gunpowder, the smell of fresh blood, and the shattering of a church bell in the darkness. Betrayal has never been so silent. The elevator doors slammed shut with a mechanical roar. It carried Mateo's desperate gaze. The traitor betrayed his master because his young daughter was kidnapped. The camera pans at a narrow angle. The cold light of the cellar shone on Elena's bruised face as she clutched the wire cutter like a sacred relic. The director doesn't give us a way out. The tragic fragments reach their climax when Dante plunges into the darkness. His hands, stained with the blood of his enemies, trembled as he lifted the face of the woman he swore he had never loved with a heart-wrenching tenderness.
Here we witness the final act. It culminates when Dante Salvatore speaks the words that shatter the fragile architecture of their shared fiction. Don't confuse duty with love. This is a surgeon's incision, a moment of psychological finality. He is a figure carved from merciless authority, wielding a silence more potent than any spoken threat. For 11 months, she existed in his orbit in a state of sustained, breathless terror. She learned to parse the grammar of his quiet, the deliberate slide of a rosary through his fingers, the calculated distance he maintained. Hope, in this universe, was a terminal illness. Within 2 minutes, she vanishes. Within 2 hours, his hunters will be unleashed. And the tube she protects, the one inheritance from her father, contains the power to bring his entire empire to ruin. The documents sealed inside were a legacy, offering only 2 possible futures: the preservation of Dante Salvatore's dominion, or the absolute, final destruction of the lie that bound them together. It started at the study door. The first sound was the rosary, a quiet, rhythmic click of black onyx on skin. Was it an act of faith or a prelude to violence? The cadence was far too serene, making it more unnerving than any command. She stood outside with a tray, the espresso turning cold while men inside planned a murder in hushed Italian. The door, left slightly ajar, was a calculated performance, a signal to the entire household of where the power resided. A subordinate's voice murmured, "Too messy." Then Dante's declaring ownership. He touched what was mine. Nothing more was required. A chair scraped, followed by the heavy sound of a body hitting wood. Her face remained a placid mask. In 11 months, she had learned that survival demanded perfect stillness. The marble floor was as cold as a cathedral in deep winter, a chill that seeped through the soles of her shoes. Below, the low hum of the estate's generators provided a constant drone. Here she was, a woman owned by Chicago's most feared man, performing the role of a wife, delivering coffee as if any of this could be considered normal. The door was thrown open, its force rattling the cups on her tray. Matteo Bianchi, his head of security, filled the doorway. His jaw was a tight knot of muscle. A fine spray of another man's blood marked his cuff. "Signora!" he grunted. The title made her feel sick. Not because it was a falsehood, but because, in this broken reality, it was the unimpeachable truth. She stepped into the room. Dante stood across from her by the windows, his jacket discarded, tie loosened, sleeves rolled once to expose his forearms. The study's air was a mix of cedar, gun oil, and the cold draft that slipped past the old window seals. On the carpet between 2 guards lay a man, his breathing a shallow, desperate rasp. Dante ignored the espresso she offered, his gaze fixed on a map spread across the desk. One hand was braced against the polished wood. The other, at his side, clenched and unclenched in a tremor of suppressed violence. It was then she noticed it. The fresh smear of blood across his knuckles. Her eyes were drawn to it, an impulse she couldn't fight. He saw her looking. "Leave it," he commanded. The words were aimed at everything at once. The tray, her gaze, the entire scene. With Dante, a single verb could serve as a leash. She placed the espresso on the table. A wet, choking sound came from the floor. Any rational woman would have turned around and left. Any person with a functioning survival instinct would have fled. But the blood was already starting to snake toward his wrist, and driven by a logic she could not articulate, she moved across the room. She took a linen napkin from the tray and reached for his hand. The tension in the air changed, becoming something sharp and breathless. She saw the shift in the guards as they stiffened. She saw it in the man on the floor, who stared through a swelling eye as if watching a woman willingly place her head inside a lion's mouth. Dante's fingers contracted, a predatory reflex with enough force to crush her bones. He stopped himself. She lifted his hand. The skin over the bone was split wide open. She folded the linen over the injury, her touch a strange, gentle anomaly in a room built on brutality. He stared down at the top of her head, his silence a palpable weight. The rosary beads clicked once against the gold of his ring. "No one cleaned that," she said, the words a desperate attempt to fill the void. "It'll break open again." His voice was a low growl. "Are you giving me orders?" "No." She tightened the makeshift bandage. "I'm saving Teresa's carpet." It was a lie deployed to save her life. One of the guards made a choked sound, a laugh he swallowed before it could cost him dearly. Dante's gaze then lifted to her face, examining her as if seeing her for the first time. His eyes were dark, impenetrable. A faint scar cut through his temple, a piece of his history she knew never to ask about, and a line was etched at the corner of his mouth, a tell that only surfaced in moments of his deepest fury. He inhabited his power as if it were a second skin, an undeniable presence that was an intrinsic part of his being. "Little saint," he murmured. It was not a term of affection. It was a diagnosis, a label. He had first used it 3 weeks after their wedding, after she requested food be sent to a guard who had been shot. He used it then, just as he used it now, to frame her compassion as a weakness, a naive flaw that was an inconvenience in his world. She released his hand. The guards dragged the man from the floor. Matteo closed the door behind them. The study grew quiet again, but it was a toxic silence, thick with the residue of violence. Dante flexed his hand, testing the knot she had made. "You should be upstairs. I was bringing you coffee." "You shouldn't have been outside this room." She looked at the map, at the blood smudged near its border, at the untouched espresso cup, a perfect tableau of their existence. For a fleeting instant, something crossed his face, not warmth. It was closer to recognition, a silent acknowledgement that he had so thoroughly dismantled her fear it was no longer visible. He had forged her into this. He had bound her to him 11 months prior in a cold chapel with 6 witnesses, 2 visible firearms, and a single sentence that reshaped her reality. "You will be under my protection." There were no vows exchanged, no promises of a shared future, only that one word, protection. A compelling word when you are 24 and consumed by grief, naive enough to believe that safety, given enough time, might one day feel like love. The question emerged from nowhere. Her plan was to take the tray and disappear. Instead, she heard her own voice give form to the internal conflict that was tearing her apart. "Was any of it real?" The generator hummed into the silence. Dante's gaze remained locked on hers. "Be specific." She hated when he did that. It was his method for communicating that he already knew the question. "The marriage," she managed to say. Why you kept me. Why you watched over me like I was an assignment and not. The sentence died. She faced two choices: expose the raw, vulnerable heart of her hope, or retreat. He decided for her. Because I promised your father, he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. Because with my name, you were a harder target to hit. He paused, the rosary making a single sharp click. If you're asking if I married you because I loved you, Elena, the answer is no. The room did not collapse. The floor remained solid under her feet. Then he delivered the second, more devastating blow. I never loved you. His voice did not rise. The brutality was in its clinical delivery, a fact presented like a final report. She expected to feel shame. Instead, there was only a clean, decisive break deep inside her, a wound invisible to any eye. She offered a single nod. Her throat tightened. All right, she whispered. He blinked. Just once. There would be no crying. Tears would be a form of surrender. Her hands needing a task reached for the tray. He observed her hands arranging the cups, smoothing a napkin, as if imposing order on a silver tray could somehow resolve the chaos his words had created. Elena. He had not spoken her name that way in days. She looked up. He appeared poised to say something else, perhaps to soften the impact, perhaps to twist the knife deeper. She would never know. She did the only thing possible to salvage what remained of her identity. She turned and walked out. In her room, she retrieved the document tube from its hiding place, gathered her father's old leather working tools, and the worn prayer book with a broken spine she'd owned since she was 12. She left his wedding ring at the nightstand. She left the silk robes his housekeeper had prepared. She walked away from a life she was never truly permitted to inhabit. Matteo was positioned at the base of the main staircase. Signora, don't, she said, her voice soft. Perhaps it was the look on her face, a calm so profound it bordered on madness. But he understood that stopping her was impossible. He let her pass. The November air was a shock against her skin. The front gate stood open, a rare lapse in security, born from the absolute certainty that his wife would never simply walk out into the night. The city air tasted of damp pavement, car exhaust, and the wind coming off the lake. She kept walking. Behind her, the gate swung shut with the finality of a closing tomb. She never looked back. She returned to her point of origin, the apartment above St. Cecilia. His men were already present, his protocols already enveloping her. The apartment held the scent of her former life. Old paper, bookbinders' glue, and dust. 3 small rooms, sloping floors, and windows that rattled in the wind, all situated above the Bellini book restoration studio. She hadn't been inside for nearly a year. Dante's men had cleared it out after the wedding, removing her work under the pretext of her own safety. But now, unlocking the door at 3 a.m, the air was a ghost. It smelled of paste, linen, lavender, and the faint, enduring scent of her father's pipe tobacco. A life constructed on a human scale. Her return begins in darkness, the strap of a bag digging into her shoulder as an involuntary shudder grips her for what she registers as exactly 23 seconds. The source isn't simply Dante's cruelty, though that is a component, nor is it the immediate sting of a fresh disappointment. The true grief is for the apartment itself, for its stubborn insistence on belonging to her, resisting any attempt to erase her from its history. She wipes her face, places her father's case of tools on the table, and starts the ritual of checking the locks. At 8 a.m, A knock sounds. She opens it with a letter opener held like a dagger. Paolo Greco's gaze registers the improvised weapon, then meets hers before he releases a deep sigh. He is a formidable figure, his large frame stretching the fabric of an expensive coat, a body engineered for methodical violence. Two of his associates stand behind him. Further down the corridor, a woman I recognize as Dr. Mia Ferraro is visible in navy scrubs, carrying a familiar leather doctor's bag. "Good morning," Paolo offers. "To say you look well would be untrue, and my respect for the deceased is too great to begin the day with a lie." I offer no response. He presents a paper bag. "Teresa sent pastries. I brought black coffee for its bitterness, and protein bars for myself, as my life is a form of incarceration." One can just see Mia roll her eyes. It's a line he uses whenever he opts for boiled chicken over something enjoyable. It's not a choice. It's a capitulation to the necessary. Despite everything, the corner of my mouth twitches upward. Paolo catches the fleeting expression indicating her as though she has just confirmed his entire worldview. "See?" The subject shows a response. "What do you want?" I demanded. His entire demeanor shifted. The performer was gone, replaced by a coiled threat, even as his features remained impassive. "Because you departed Salvatore security without proper clearance, and now every wannabe with a firearm and a bad idea believes you're open season." "You're talking about Dante." "I'm talking about Chicago." His eyes drift past me into the room. "Are you going to permit us entry? Or are you planning to stab us individually because I missed my morning workout?" I should have refused. Instead, I stepped aside. They entered the space with the silent economy of men accustomed to walking into ambushes. Paolo places the bag of pastries down, with the reverence of a sacred object before his gaze sweeps the kitchen. "No provisions," he notes, his tone laced with theatrical sorrow. "My lady, what form of protest is this?" "The kind that begins with a departure in the dead of night." "I see." He nods as if deep psychological trauma and a lack of basic nutrition were well-documented companions. "A strategic withdrawal." Mia sets her bag on the table, her sharp eyes evaluating me with the air of someone who has sutured men while they were actively spinning lies to her. "Are there any physical wounds?" "No." "Have you slept?" "No." "Excellent," she remarked. "At least we have honesty." Paolo is already inspecting the room, checking for vulnerabilities, access points, and, one assumes, any secret reserves of carbohydrates. The boss's directives are a 4-man rotation, curtains closed after dusk, and you are to call before leaving. "I don't follow his directives?" "Then follow mine," he retorted with forced cheerfulness. "I'm far more agreeable." I folded my arms across my chest. "You're maddening." "That's also a fact." He was still smiling as he repositioned the chair nearest the door, sat on it facing backward, and laid a handgun on the table with deliberate visibility. The perceived temperature of the room plummeted. "That element," he stated, his voice now devoid of humor, "is not a negotiation. A knot formed in my gut." Outside, the bells from St. Cecilia's started their 9 chimes, a sound that once simply signaled the start of a day. I detested how fear could contaminate a cherished space, twisting every comforting object into a potential threat. "I returned here because it was the one place that still felt like my own," I said. If Dante requires another cage, he can construct one. Paolo's expression shifted, not softening, but becoming more guarded. He didn't dispatch me to help you vanish, Elena. He used my given name. That, even more than the weapon, put me on edge. What were his instructions? To ensure you remain breathing. A second knock preempted any possible reply. No one in the room reacted, which was the most unnerving part of all. Paolo simply stood. Mia retrieved her bag. One of his men positioned himself to the left of the door, the other to the right. I sat down the letter opener, suddenly conscious of its inadequacy. Paolo opened the door. Dante entered as if he held the deed to the very air. He wore black wool, foregoing an overcoat in the cold, with droplets of rain clinging to his shoulders. The hallway behind him fell silent, an absence of sound that seemed to be his constant companion. He closed the door himself, and his eyes surveyed the apartment. The antique drafting table, the shelves of repaired artifacts, the unwashed glasses in the sink. Then his attention settled on me. The raw abrasion on his knuckles was now covered by a neat bandage. Someone else had completed the task I had initiated. The specificity of that notion was vile. "You are not secure here," he stated. No greeting, no apology. It was exactly what I anticipated. I wasn't secure in your home either. For a split second, his gaze flickered to my bare hand, to the space where his ring had been. It is different. It felt identical. The ensuing silence was a heavy, tangible thing. Paolo, likely calculating his chances of being caught in the crossfire, retrieved a protein bar from his pocket and murmured, "I'll be consuming this in the corridor like a man on death row." Mia grabbed his arm and guided him out. The guards followed. The apartment door clicked, leaving Dante and me alone for the first time since that night in the study. He advanced toward me, and I held my ground. The impulse to retreat was strong. I suppressed it. "That was ill-advised," he said. "You provided me with the truth." I acted accordingly. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "You left without protection. You left without a husband." The words found their mark. I saw them register. That minute, rigid shift in his expression. I shouldn't have wanted to witness it, but I did. He invaded my personal space, so close I could smell the chill on his coat, a scent of cedar and smoke. My heart rate quickened. He noticed. The man perceived everything. "There are people searching for what your father concealed," he said, his voice lowered. "They will leverage you to locate it." I have nothing. Riccardo Viscari thinks differently. The name was an ominous presence within the Salvatore hierarchy. I knew of it from conversations that would abruptly change course. Advisor, a friend of the family. My father once described him as charming, using the same inflection one might use for a beautiful, venomous reptile. If this was about my father, you should have informed me prior to our marriage. Yes. That simple acknowledgement struck with more force than any denial could have. I stared at him. "Is that all you can say?" "It is the truth." A short, incredulous laugh escaped my lips. "The truth is a tool you only employ when it can be used as a weapon." His gaze lowered to my mouth and lingered there a moment too long. That was the first time it nearly happened. It existed in the charged air between us, something acute, unthinkable, a feeling I refused to acknowledge. Then he pulled back. "You can remain here for the day," he declared. "Tonight you will be relocated to one of my safe houses. No, little saint." the coldness returned, a quiet, proprietary tone. He spoke the words as if his palm were resting in the back of my neck. "No," I repeated. He glanced at the prayer book on my table, the one I had taken without conscious thought. His eyes remained on it, his face an unreadable mask. He crossed to the window, pulled the curtain aside just enough to survey the street below and let it drop. "You can despise me from a more secure location," he said. "I don't despise you." That was the entire issue. We both understood that. When he faced me again, his stillness had taken on a dangerous quality. I should have retracted the statement. I stood motionless, my hands shaking at my sides, allowing him to see the tremor I had not yet learned to conceal. He said nothing more. There was no need. After he left, Paolo re-entered, now holding 3 more protein bars and wearing an expression of tactical misery. "Well," he commented, his gaze flicking between me and the now closed door. That was sufficiently stressful to qualify as cardio. I collapsed into a chair as my legs gave way. By midday, armed men were posted in the hall, and a new black sedan was stationed at the corner. Dante's world was being superimposed over mine, iron being fused to lace. I was home, but his shadow had arrived first. Chapter 3. The ledger room. He was aware of which pages had been removed. By the afternoon, the apartment had ceased to be a refuge. It now felt like a guarded museum piece. I worked regardless. That was the singular virtue of mending damaged paper. It monopolized the focus of one's hands, leaving little mental space for the feeling of being utterly disempowered. The studio below had weathered its year of abandonment better than I had. A layer of dust coated the long oak tables, but they remained sturdy. The printing presses stood against the far wall like enormous, patient sentinels. My father's old magnifying lamp was still positioned over the main workbench, its bulb faded by time. When I switched it on, its faint yellow glow populated the room with the echoes of all the quiet, painstaking hours we had shared in this space. The faded blue of her apron served as a canvas for her existence, worn thin by labor, marked by a single ink blot on the pocket, a bloom of shadow, a secret held close. It was a part of her. From the floor above, the heavy, rhythmic fall of boots on wood announced a patrol, or perhaps a cage. The distinction between the two is merely a matter of perspective, dictated by the architecture of one's fear. Beneath the lamplight's focused glow, a prayer book lay open. It was a relic, first her mother's until the fever claimed her, then passed down after her father began to treat God as a matter of professional obligation rather than faith. Its leather edges, softened to the texture of velvet, testified to the generations of hands that had clung to it. 2 years prior, the spine had surrendered. She recalled the act of mending it, stitching new linen into its core as her father observed from across the table, his expression a cipher she could not solve then, and understood even less now. This was the same book Dante had examined that very morning, turning it in his hands as if it were a complex lock he had once failed to pick. Throughout the day, the book projected an aura of wrongness, an object out of sync with the established order of her world. Her inspection began where secrets are most often interred, the hinge. To restore an object is to perform a kind of surgery, a séance with the past. The paper itself will confess its wounds if one can quiet the noise of their own heart long enough to listen. She laid the artifact flat, easing the slender steel of a micro spatula under the new lining. She felt it instantly. A structural dissonance. This was not the frailty of age. It was an imbalance of weight. One board was heavier. She went still. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, a spectral warning. Discovery must never be rushed. A clumsy hand destroys the very truth it seeks. With immense care, she applied a whisper of moisture to the paste-down seam, felt the old linen relent and lifted a corner. Just enough. There, carved from the board's very core, was the ghost of a cavity. It was vacant. Her heart paused. A thing had been concealed here. Something slender, something long, something with the precise dimensions of a folded slip of paper. Below, the bell on the shop door sang out, a sharp, violent tear the fabric of the quiet. She flinched, the edge of a nail leaving a scar upon the page as a curse slipped from her lips. She veiled the book with a cloth and moved toward the stairs. In the doorway stood Paolo, balancing 2 coffees, his entire being a protest against the laws of gravity. An offering, he announced. 1 black to honor the continuation of your suffering, 1 with sugar, for even martyrs require fuel. You're without employment, I take it? I am not. Has my existence become your full-time profession? He raised a paper bag. And no, before you begin, I did not bring pastries. Mia claims if I continue to consume my emotions, my jawline will be relegated to a historical footnote. Mia is an astute woman. A look of theatrical agony washed over Paolo's face as he clutched his chest. Softer, I beg you, my affection for her has already critically undermined my will to live. He climbed the stairs as if they were his own, a walking demonstration of the principle that in Dante's sphere, a boundary is merely a suggestion. His gaze swept her workspace, followed by a low whistle. This room always carries the scent of rain on parched earth and the dust of a crumbling church. It's book paste, she replied, her tone flat. Regardless of the source, the stimulus compels me to confess sins I have yet to orchestrate. That presumes you have the self-control to wait. Unkind. He placed the coffees on the lone, clear surface of the table, and his eyes settled on the prayer book. Is this the artifact in question? Her voice was sharp. Questioned by whom? He raised his hands in a gesture of immediate capitulation. Not by me. Be careful. It belongs to individuals who were explicitly forbidden from touching it. And that could only point to Dante. A cold dread coiled in her stomach. Before the feeling could metastasize into anger or fear, the bell chimed again. This time, every ounce of performance drained from Paolo's face. He moved past her, his right hand already disappearing inside his coat. Stay here, he commanded. She did not listen. From the landing, she watched Matteo admit Dante. He swept into the studio, his coat dark and damp from the night, his eyes like weapons, taking inventory of the tables, the shelves. Paolo's now cooling coffee, the linen shroud that concealed the book. This is a violation, she said, the words escaping of their own accord. The way you enter a room, as if you are its final judgment. A sound left Paolo, something caught between a prayer and a plea. Dante paid it no mind. Show me. The correct response was no. The only response was no. Instead, she drew back the linen cloth. He moved to her side at the table, collapsing the fragile perimeter of her personal space. His proximity was such that she could feel the warmth radiating from him through her sleeve, a stark island of heat in the room's cool air. A rosary was coiled once around his hand, dark beads on pale skin, a single sharp click. Her heart hammered against her ribs in answer. There was a cavity in the board, she reported, her voice deliberately clinical. It is now empty. You commissioned the spine's repair 2 years ago. That is accurate. Who had access to the book after that? My father. And myself. No one else. Dante's gaze shifted from the exposed board to her face. Are you certain? She turned to meet his eyes, wounded by the implication. This is my area of expertise. He held her stare. I am aware. He spoke the words with a peculiar gravity. It was not dismissal, nor was it doubt. It was something that unsettled her far more deeply. It was respect. This was the second time he had nearly made contact, not with his hands, but with the silent, invasive comprehension. The feeling of being observed, of being measured with unnerving precision in the very center of her own world. She gestured to the board. There's more. She adjusted the lamp, allowing its beam to skim the paper. There, in the gutter margin beneath the old flyleaf, were almost invisible score marks, the phantom impression of a thin object being inserted and removed, time and again. It indicates routine access, she observed. This was not a singular event. Paolo watched them, his expression riveted, like a man observing a volatile chemical reaction, awaiting the outcome. Dante's mouth was a single, hard line. Your father was conducting an operation without my knowledge to ensure your survival. A clean, hot wave of fury crested within her. Then perhaps everyone in this city can cease making unilateral decisions regarding my survival. Before a response could be formed, the rear window imploded in a cataclysm of glass. Matteo dropped to the floor on instinct. An instant later, Paolo's hand slammed onto her shoulder, forcing her down as the sound finally registered. The room became a cacophony of chaos, the thunder of boots on stone, the suppressed crack of firearms, Teresa's scream from somewhere above, and Paolo frantically whispering about the injustice of dying without a final meal. Dante's reaction was a terrifying study in efficiency. In one fluid motion, he overturned the heavy work table, creating a barricade for her and the book. He drew his pistol and fired twice through the shattered window before her mind could process the shadow that had just passed. The sharp, metallic scent of gunpowder overwhelmed the sweeter notes of old paper and paste. "Stay down," he commanded. This time, she offered no argument. The gunfire ceased as abruptly as it began, replaced by the wail of distant sirens. Matteo's voice cut through the silence, speaking urgently into a radio. Beside her, Paolo muttered, "If I die before Mia consents to dinner, I will haunt every last one of you." She looked up. Dante was still positioned over her. One hand braced on the table, his body a shield between her and the broken window. A thin line of blood traced a path down his jaw from where a glass shard had sliced him. "You're bleeding," she observed. He stared down at her for a long beat, as if her statement held more weight than the firefight that had just concluded. Then he straightened. "They located the book too quickly," he said to Matteo. "We have a leak." The word itself was a betrayal hanging in the air thick as gunsmoke. As his men moved to secure the window, Dante retrieved the prayer book himself, handing it to her as if it were a primed explosive. "You are coming with me," he stated. It was not a request. She clutched the book to her chest. "No!" His gaze shifted from the ruined window back to her face. "That is your consent." He was mistaken. Consent was not the operative term. The operative term was the sudden, nauseating realization that he had understood the book's significance long before she had, and he had allowed her to remain in ignorance. Dante had first taken note of her hands, of the remarkable steadiness with which they handled fractured things. He had noted it that night in his study, as she tended to his bleeding hand, not as a woman touching a man, but as a scientist studying a specimen. Now, watching her shield the prayer book beneath the shattered window, Dante comprehended two facts with a perfect, chilling clarity. Ricardo was no longer playing a waiting game, and Elena Bellini would walk into her own grave before she could be made to bend. God have mercy on the men who would mistake that resolve for weakness. Chapter 4. The Chapel Stairwell. In the darkness, his hand found the curve of her waist. Dante did not return her to the Salvatore compound. He brought her to the chapel at the estate's far northern edge, the repository where his family interred both their dead and their secrets. It was a structure set apart from the main villa, guarded by a silent phalanx of cypress trees. It was a stone-faced and solitary building, the sort of place the very rich and the very guilty construct keep their God close, but not so close as to be inconvenient. As the narrative begins, the sky itself is a casualty, described as a bruise, an immediate visual metaphor for the world we are entering. This is a domain of quiet, disciplined violence, where armed men move like specters across consecrated ground. The chapel, with its immense walnut doors, functions less as a house of God and more as a tomb of judgment. Inside, the imagery reinforces this duality. The bleeding light of votive candles and the watchful eyes of gilded saints suggest a place that has long made its peace with sin. The narrator's presence is framed as a transgression, an outsider observing the rites of a brutal, unfamiliar faith from a hollow, chilling distance. The dialogue reveals the core tenets of this world. Dante's correction, "It's a place where the walls aren't listening," is not about safety but secrecy, a necessary condition for survival. He dissects the narrator's emotional state, not with empathy, but with the grating accuracy of a predator. Into this cold dynamic steps Teresa Rossetti, the estate's matriarchal figure. She brings not threats but blankets and tea, symbols of a domestic world almost entirely erased. Her touch is a profound anomaly, a moment of non-transactional kindness in an ecosystem where everything and everyone has a price. She represents a different kind of power, one rooted in care rather than coercion. She is the architect of small mercies in a place devoid of them. Smuggled cannoli, novels left like secret offerings, and the unspoken grace of not asking about tears shed in a gilded cage. Her draping of a blanket is a symbolic act of preservation, treating the narrator as something more than just another asset. From the pews, Dante watches this exchange, his fingers methodically working a rosary. Click, click, click. Each sound is a punctuation mark in the silent, oppressive liturgy of his power. The arrival of Paolo and Mia injects a brief, dark humor, a coping mechanism for those who live in the shadow of men like Dante, using levity to survive their own profound suffering. In their world, even pastries are an act of rebellion. Mia's interaction with Dante is telling. She tends to his wound with a pragmatism that borders on defiance. His reaction to her touch near his temple is a microscopic flinch, a glimpse of a history that predates the current conflict. It isn't a response to physical pain, but the recoiling of a man from a memory. His terse dismissal, "I'm fine," is immediately exposed as a falsehood. Mia's retort, "Men like you are always so disappointingly hard to kill," captures the weary resentment of those caught in his orbit. Paolo's apathetic plea for Dante to wear a sweater is less about health and more about avoiding Teresa's wrath, a subtle acknowledgement of where the true power in that household resides. When Dante removes his shirt, the act becomes an unwilling confession. The network of scars across his body is a brutal cartography of his life, a testament to the violence he has both endured and mastered to maintain his position. One scar in particular, a crescent branded near his collarbone, speaks not just of a wound, but of an attempted annihilation. The narrator's gaze, though quickly averted, crosses an invisible threshold. It is a moment of forbidden intimacy, seeing the private history etched onto the public figure. Teresa, with a soul-reading acuity, perceives this shift and orders her away, shielding her from a truth she is not yet meant to comprehend. The upstairs rooms, once meant for priests, are now sterile holding cells, their narrow windows offering imprisonment instead of comfort. Here, the central conflict begins to crystallize around a simple prayer book, an object of faith now repurposed as a vessel for conspiracy. When Dante appears, the simple act of changing from a bloodied shirt to a plain sweater transforms him. The public armor of the boss is shed, revealing something far more potent: the man. The rosary, still in his hands, is a constant symbol of his paradoxical nature, a man of violence clinging to the rituals of salvation. His face, carved by exhaustion, is a mask of the burden he carries. Their exchange is not a conversation but a debriefing. The warmth of a typical domestic scene is replaced with the cold calculus of survival. He reveals the truth about her father's death, not as a tragedy, but as a strategic gambit in a larger war. The prayer book is the key, a hiding place for proof of betrayal, names, routes, shipments. Her father's final move was to weaponize his own murder, ensuring that the evidence would fall into the right eyes. Dante's words frame the narrator's existence as a liability, a piece on a board she never knew she was playing on, now in unimaginable danger from a rival, Riccardo Viscari. Dante lays the strategy bare. The marriage was a hostile takeover of her identity. It was a way to put my name over yours. Not an act of love, but an act of annexation, a shield that is also a cage. The revelation that this was her own father's plan is the ultimate betrayal, removing the last vestiges of her agency. Dante's justification is rooted in brutal logic. Her safety and the secrecy of the information were paramount. His claim, "You were the entire point," reframes her from a pawn into the linchpin of the entire conflict. When he outlines his choice, to bury her or to protect her, he reveals the fundamental law of his world. Protection and control are one and the same. The narrator's acknowledgement, "I did," confirms her complicity in her own entrapment. The narrative voice notes the maddening nature of Dante's honesty. He never softens the truth, which perversely makes him harder to despise. This complex dynamic is shattered by the primal cry of a fire alarm. Smoke, a tangible threat, invades their sterile room of secrets. Dante's transformation is instantaneous. The calculating strategist vanishes, replaced by something instinctual and animalistic. The fear is not ordinary. It is the triggering of a deep-seated trauma as he grabs her and pulls her into the chaos. The source of the fire is mundane: a candelabra, altar cloths, a simple accident that unleashes hell in a holy place. Amid the chaos, Dante's grip is absolute, his body a shield. This is not the measured control of before, it is a visceral, protective impulse. When a falling cross stand nearly kills her, he pulls her against his chest. The impact forces her hand flat against the knotted scar tissue beneath his sweater. In that moment of physical contact, the past and present collide. It is a connection forged in violence, a direct touch to the source of his pain, and she feels the tremor of an old wound, a ghost sealed within his skin. He hauls her from the smoke, and the shock of cold air is like a second baptism. Crouching before her, Dante's face is a mask of fury, but the anger is not directed at the fire or at her. It is aimed inward, at a memory ignited by the smoke. His words, forced from him as if from a great depth, are a confession. Lucia died in smoke, my sister. The mystery of his primal reaction is solved. The fire was never just a fire, it was a ghost. He was not just saving a woman, he was reliving the failure to save his sister. As he rises to resume command, the boss reemerges, but the veil has been lifted, revealing the unhealed trauma that fuels the man within. Lucia, at 16, and his mother, Sofia Salvatore. The memories return, not as a narrative, but as burnt fragments of film. A car ablaze, casting an orange glow upon a road just beyond Juliet. Dante was 19 then, arriving only to witness the ruin. In the chapel yard, amidst his men, the ash and the shriek of sirens, a stark truth crystallized for Elena. His capacity for tenderness was not absent. It was merely a captive, barricaded by smoke and a history written in fire. Case File 5. The Burned Margins. Her father had concealed a truth within a prayer. At dawn, the chapel's air was dense with the aroma of damp stone and snuffed-out candles. The fire was quelled swiftly, less an attack than a statement, but it left an indelible black wound across the stonework, the soot clinging to the effigy of a saint. In the gray light, men worked in a silence so profound it felt like a rite. Sabotage. The word hung in the air, a specter felt in each hushed footstep. In Dante's sphere, calamities never possessed such precise, damning timing. She sat at the upstairs desk, the prayer book open beneath a magnifier as the dawn's first light filtered through the tall, slender window. Sleep had offered no sanctuary. Each time she closed her eyes, the phantom impression of Dante's hand on her waist returned, a somatic memory that defied conscious thought. It was assured, unwavering, the touch of a man shaped by disaster. She loathed how her own body held on to it with the fidelity her pride could never subdue. The fire did more than scar stone. It unsealed things that were meant to remain entombed. Heat dissolves adhesive. Moisture reveals old men's flames. Her father often noted, always exposed the falsehoods in a binding. He had spoken of glue, of leather, of forgeries within ancient tomes. She never grasped until this morning that his words were also a treatise on men. She positioned the heat-warped flyleaf under the lamp, observing as faint, ghostly lines materialized, born from the movement of trapped air within the paper's own memory. It was not script, not quite. It was the impression of his hand, a testament left by her father. The impressions were fine, disciplined, the ghost of a hand that had no tolerance for any instrument that was not sharp. She lightly dusted the page with graphite powder. The incised lines absorbed the darkness, growing just distinct enough to be read. These were not prayers. They were ledgers, shipping manifests, figures, the initials of streets, and then a single line pressed into the paper with the ferocity that had nearly ruptured it. El Salvatore Root. Viscari cleared. Her throat became dust. Lucia. From the gloom behind her, a floorboard creaked. She whirled around so abruptly the magnifier fell from her grasp, clattering against the desk. Dante was framed in this doorway. His coat was draped over one arm, his hair still wet and dark, and a black rosary was wrapped once around his knuckles. He gave no excuse for his sudden appearance. He never did. The sole announcement of his presence was the palpable way the atmosphere in a room would grow still and dense. "You found something?" It was an assertion, not an inquiry. Her gaze returned to the page. "You knew my father was keeping a record." "I knew he suspected a betrayer within my own ranks." "That is not the same thing." "No." His eyes moved to the pressure marks, the phantom script on the page. "It is not." Everything in her history and training urged her to shut the book, to demand explanations before disclosing a thing. But the only sound she could process was the panicked, erratic beat of her own heart, and she despised its noise so intensely she would have done anything to make it cease. She retrieved the magnifier, adjusted the lens. She forced her voice into a state of calm. "Their impression traces," she articulated. "He wrote on another sheet placed over this one. Sufficient pressure leaves a memory in the fibers. The fire's heat has made it visible." Dante moved closer. He did not make contact. He rarely did when the stakes were highest, but his proximity was enough for her to catch the crisp smell of soap over cedar, of clean linen over something far, far colder. The night's chill still clung to his form. In the lamplight, his silhouette was a study in sharp angles and deep shadows. He remained silent for a considerable moment. Then his voice emerged, remarkably quiet. "Read it to me." And so she complied. 3 shipping lanes, 2 financial transactions, 4 sets of initials she recognized from Salvatore family dinners, and Lucia's name, bound irrevocably to Viscari's. When she concluded, the silence that descended was not one of emptiness. It was a silence with an edge, a point. "My father had more than this," she stated, her voice frail. "He would never embed an entire war in a single prayer book and call it a mere precaution." Dante's focus shifted, fixing on the leather document cylinder that rested on the shelf next to her tools. She followed his gaze a fraction too late, and that is how the secret she guarded was extracted from her, not through her words, but because his stare located it and held it captive. "You took that when you departed," he observed, and the words were not an observation. They were a verdict. Worse, they were an affirmation of a truth she had concealed. She folded her arms across her chest. "It belonged to my father." "What is in it?" "Nothing." "Elena." She detested the way he could utter her name and render any lie a fragile, inadequate construction. She took the cylinder from the shelf. Her own fingers felt clumsy and strange as she worked the brass cap loose. A single scroll of vellum emerged into her palm. She had examined it twice since her father's funeral and had understood none of it. Only a sequence of numbers and a wax seal compressed by the passage of time. She kept it solely because he had pressed it into her hand a week before his death. "If I cannot complete this," he had told her, "do not allow a Bellini cowardice to entomb what is true." She had withheld it from Dante. Trusting him felt too much like a capitulation. Now the vellum was between them, a tangible object, a monument to her silence. A muscle in his jaw flexed. "You have possessed this the entire time." "I did not understand its meaning." "But you possessed it." She met his gaze directly. "And had I given it to you, would you have told me the truth?" A vein throbbed at his temple. It was not the answer she sought. He did not touch the vellum until she laid it upon the desk herself. Under the lamp, the aged ink appeared in dark columns. A ledger, names set against dates, against payments, against shipping lanes. One column was written in her father's Latin shorthand, a method learned in old ecclesiastical libraries. His script trained to cloak the language of commerce in the vestments of the sacred. Dante scanned it once rapidly before his eyes traced its length again, this time with more deliberation. Ricardo was paid to ensure the Joliet route was clear, Dante stated, his tone devoid of emotion. The very air in the room seemed to thicken around the confession. For Lucia, for the car. The realization forced her into a chair, her legs suddenly refusing to support her. Her father had known, or he had learned afterward. And rather than expose the treachery, he had concealed it, understanding that public truths have a tendency to get men like him killed. He went to Dante, and Dante married her. In that horrifying chain of events, both men had treated her not as a daughter deserving the truth, but as a piece to be maneuvered on a board as her world collapsed. Her throat felt scoured. Did you know before this that Ricardo was the one who sold them out? No, Dante replied. The honesty was instantaneous, and somehow that fact was infuriating. His hand moved toward the prayer book, then paused, hovering just above the fire-damaged edge. You mended this. I did. The spine was sound despite the flames. That's the mark of well-treated linen. She swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet. You believe violence is the only thing that binds the world. At last, his gaze lifted to hers. And you believe care can change a thing's inherent purpose, he countered. Neither broke contact. It was their fourth such precipice. Not the promise of a kiss, but an event far more unsettling. It was a moment of stark recognition, where she saw the genuine danger of him ever offering a kind word and truly meaning it. A hard rap at the door fractured the tension between them. Matteo entered without ceremony, his expression unreadable. Boss, movement at the east gate. 2 vans not in the log, Paolo's on it. Dante's features smoothed into a cold mask. And one camera feed went dead 10 minutes prior to their arrival. An inside man is, she said, the words feeling like poison on her tongue. Matteo's gaze settles upon her. For a fleeting instant, something registers in that stoic mask. A flicker of respect, perhaps, or concern. Within a world built on the nuanced language of threat, such expressions are deliberately ambiguous. Yes, he confirms, his voice flat. And not from the ground floor. Dante presents the vellum. Secure this in the lower vault. Matteo accepts the document, but before he can pivot, her voice cuts through the charged silence. No? The 2 men turn. If that document disappears, she states, her voice trembling almost imperceptibly, all that remains is your word against my father's death. She rises, a tremor running through her frame. I am making a copy. A faint arch of Matteo's eyebrow signals the anomaly. A woman issuing a polite refusal to an armed man is a disruption of the natural order. Dante gives a curt, formal nod. You have 1 minute. She complies. Vellum demands patience, a quality they both possess. Yet the velocity of her hands is a skill forged in long, solitary practice. She places the artifact flat, securing it under glass, and laying a sheet of translucent archival tissue over it. Angling a raking lamp, she causes the ink to rise in stark relief from the page as she begins to transcribe the columns in a mirrored script. It is a method her father taught her, a private cipher designed to shield information from a casual observer. She has just completed the task when Paolo erupts into the room, a maelstrom of agitation juggling 3 phones and a single pastry, his anxiety a palpable force. "Good news," he announces, breathless. "I found the camera breach. The bad news, it was executed by a professional. We are in profound trouble." His gaze ricochets around the room. The vellum, Matteo's unreadable face, her, then Dante, and his frantic energy collapses. "Ah," he says softly. "So emotionally, we are also in profound trouble." Even Matteo's composure nearly breaks. Paolo looks at the pastry in his hand with a sudden, deep sorrow. "It is why I stress bake relationships I cannot have." Matteo's voice is as dry as dust. "Mia did not bake that." Paolo's hand instinctively tightens around the pastry. Then a sound. A quiet, fractured laugh from the patient. A fissure in the room's crushing tension. Dante's head turns. For the span of a single heartbeat, the harsh architecture of his face seems to soften, rearranging itself into something recognizably human. The moment is shattered by the crack of a gunshot from the radio on Matteo's shoulder. The atmosphere pulls taut once more. Dante is already in motion toward the door. No one moves her alone. Matteo offers a silent, sharp nod and disappears. Paolo's humor dissolves. "Boss!" "I know." Dante's focus returns to her, the brief thaw replaced by a glacial fury. "We have a traitor," he says. The words are not a hypothesis. They are a verdict. For the first time, we witness fear in Dante Salvatore. It is not for himself, but for the corruption that has taken root within his own walls. Case File 6. We recall the underpass, the crimson bloom on his shirt, as his only objective was to shield her. They were forced to flee before nightfall. This was not a choice Dante made. It was a response to Riccardo's brutal message at the East Gate, a demonstration of power meant to prove his reach. By 1800 hours, the sanctity of their chapel was a memory. By 1900, Matteo had rerouted their convoy twice, pursuing phantoms. By 2000, even Teresa's stoicism had begun to fracture. Now, inside an armored sedan, the patient sits with a prayer book on her lap and a stolen ledger concealed in her coat, watching Chicago streak past in a watercolor of wet asphalt and orange sodium light. Bridges pass like the skeletal remains of forgotten beasts. Industrial parks. The Black River mirrors the sky like a plate of sheared steel. Matteo drives, his face an impassive stone mask. In the vehicle trailing them, Paolo is with Mia. She had refused to stay at the estate, arguing that her supply of fresh bandages was insufficient for the sudden proliferation of men with firearms. "Seatbelt," Dante's voice cuts the silence. She looks up. He is beside her, a hand braced on the seat back, his eyes fixed on the side mirror, scanning for threats. He wears charcoal wool, his tie a shade of black more absolute than any priest would wear. No weapon is visible, which means at least 3 are concealed. As his hand tightens, a rosary whispers against his ring. "I am wearing one." Good. The word is a wall, devoid of comfort, and within her it ignites a sudden, reckless impulse to see that wall crack. "You could try to sound worried," she challenges, her tone a quiet provocation. "I am worried." There is a vast difference between being worried and sounding like a weather forecast. The shadow of a smile touches his lips. "Little saint, if I sounded the way I feel at this moment, Matteo would drive us directly into the river." From the driver's seat, without turning, Matteo's voice is low and resolute. Correct. It is the first sign of humor he has ever displayed, and it shocks a genuine laugh from her before the fear can reclaim her throat. Dante's eyes shift toward the sound. He does not smile, but he watches her, and something flickers in his gaze. The convoy glides under a freight overpass, its concrete pillars casting long, damp shadows across them. One feels the change before one sees it. Matteo's entire body becomes rigid. Dante's hand lands on her knee. It is not a touch, but a command. Brief, firm, absolute. Down! The world erupts. The impact strikes the lead SUV in a symphony of shrieking metal and disintegrating glass. Matteo swears, wrenching the wheel into a violent, evasive maneuver that throws her shoulder into Dante's chest. Then gunfire, not the chaotic spray of a street fight, but the disciplined, rhythmic cadence of a calculated assault. An ambush. He forces her down to the floorboard an instant before a second volley stitches across their sedan, his body becoming a human shield above her. The air grows thick with the acrid smell of cordite and the taste of pulverized safety glass. Outside, a man shouts in Russian, "This is more than Ricardo's crew. This is hired steel." "Stay under me," Dante commands. The words are redundant. There is no other space to occupy. There is no other space for her to occupy. But the order is delivered with the gravity of a sacrament. The rear window implodes, showering them with tempered glass. Through the spider-webbed windshield, Matteo returns fire. The sedan shudders as another round strikes its chassis. Dante presses a cold, heavy object into her palm. A firearm. She can only stare at it. "The safety is off," he says, his voice a calm center in the storm. "Point and pull, only if someone opens your door." "I know." The words acknowledge her innocence without judgment. He is out of the car before she can take another breath. It is a single fluid motion, door open, body low, his weapon barking with lethal intent. Through the fractured glass, she sees him in fragments, the black wool of his coat, the muzzle flash, the terrifying grace of his controlled violence. He is an embodiment of brutal economy, a man who understands that a wasted movement is a death sentence. A shadow detaches from the chaos, closing in on her door. She follows his final command. The weapon roars, kicking hard in her hand. The figure cries out, a wet, guttural noise that will echo through her nightmares for years, and falls from view. She freezes, the gun still extended. Matteo takes it from her grip without breaking his focus on the fight. "Elena," he snaps. "Breathe. You can collapse later." From the side, Paolo's voice cuts through the gunfire. "If I die, tell Mia I was at my physical peak." "Shut up and keep moving," Mia screams in return. Then a new threat emerges. A man slips from behind a pillar, a knife glinting in his hand, moving toward Dante's blind side. Dante pivots, a blur of motion. And then there is blood. His blood. A scream forms in her throat but does not escape. He puts a single, deafening round into the man and staggers back, his body colliding with the concrete pillar. A dark, wet stain blossoms on his side, spreading with appalling speed. The aftermath is a blur of instinct and protocol. The assailants vanish as quickly as they appeared. Sirens begin to keen in the distance. Matteo is on the radio, barking coordinates. Paolo runs to them, one sleeve of his jacket soaked in red. Mia rushes toward Dante, but he shoves her away with a force that communicates everything. "Elena first. I am not bleeding," she says, her voice thin. He looks at her then, his eyes performing a rapid forensic assessment of her entire body. Only when he is satisfied that she is unharmed does he finally sag against the pillar, permitting Mia to cut away the layers of his coat and shirt. And only then can one truly see the gash the knife left behind. It is not a clean wound. It is torn, deep. Blood has saturated his white shirt, turning it a brilliant, horrifying crimson. They move. They retreat to a cold apartment above a defunct flour warehouse, a space with steel doors and a single room furnished for men who negotiate peace through violence. Guards stand watch. Mia escorts Paolo away to be stitched, dismissing his injury as mostly for show. Teresa arrives before midnight with supplies, evidence of the silent network that allows Dante's world to function. The patient finds him in a Spartan room, shirtless over a rust-stained basin, as Mia pulls thread through his flesh. "You moved," she observes quietly. "You talk too much," he bites back, his voice raw with pain. "You bleed too much. I should have left you." She offers no reply. She simply walks to a cabinet, retrieves a roll of gauze, and presents it. Mia's gaze shifts from the gauze to her face, and a long, exhausted sigh escapes her. "Good," she says. "You can attempt to prevent him from ripping these stitches out." She exits, shutting the door gently behind her, encasing them together in the quiet. Dante's hands are braced on the sink's edge, his knuckles stark white. The water dripping from the tap into the basin is stained faintly pink. One of Mia's sutures has already broken free. "You are impossible," she murmurs. "So I am told." His voice is thin, weakened by blood loss. This vulnerability in him is more unsettling than any rage she has ever witnessed. As she draws nearer, he observes her in the mirror, his gaze still sharp, still predatory. Her fingers shake as they hover above the wound. Then she makes contact. Warm skin. A muscle contracts beneath her fingertips. The room is scented with iodine, with old iron plumbing, and the subtle, saline fragrance of his skin. "You ought to be in bed," he states. "You ought to have departed when I instructed you to." Would it have made any difference? Would it have prevented them? No. Then do not waste your breath on inconsequential things. For the span of a single tense heartbeat, the room is still. His head inclines in a gesture that suggests he is suppressing a grim laugh that would tear him asunder. She starts to dress the wound, her hands more certain now, her touch less clinical and more intuitive. His breathing steadies under her ministration. Hers does not. "You took my hand that night," he says, his voice low and coarse. She looks up, her hands motionless. "In the study," he articulates, his gaze pinning hers within the mirror's frame. "You never questioned what I had done. Not even a flicker of hesitation. You simply saw the blood and dressed the wound." The atmosphere in the room gains a palpable weight, a suffocating density. "That was reckless," she murmurs. "No." His eyes fall to her mouth for a bare moment before returning, a visible, violent act of self-control. It was the first selfless act directed at me in a decade that was not attached to a price. A knot forms in her throat. So this is the foundation, the true origin point. It is spoken aloud now, a truth revealed by pain in a moment of utter vulnerability. Her hand trembles as she fastens the last strip of tape. He notices everything. "Elena," he starts, "I should have walked away from you at that moment, but I didn't." She shuts her eyes. If you would stop looking at me that way, she says, her voice fracturing, I might be able to remember what my duty is. A phantom emotion flickered across his face, present and then gone, but she witnessed it. In that sliver of time, it was as if he found his justification. Dante's approach was a slow, deliberate glide, allowing her every possible second to withdraw. She remained motionless. His hand settled on her cheek, a collision of opposing textures, the coarse rasp of his thumb along her jaw, the radiating heat from his palm, the impossible delicacy he applied with the barest pressure. The contact of his lips was little more than solidified breath, her own instability the source of its tremor. His mouth was an exercise in pure control, a man treating intimacy as if it were an explosive device. He broke away before his own need could manifest, pulling back first to rest his forehead on hers. That is all, he breathed, the words a quiet devastation, because if I continue, I will forget that you are afraid. Her answer was an immediate rush of air. I am not afraid of you. The stark honesty of her words seemed to settle on them both, heavy and final. He blinked once, a slow, mechanical closure. When his eyes reopened, they were several shades darker. The war starts tonight, he declared, as if the words themselves had summoned it. A knock came from Matteo at the door. Boss, Ricardo's men hit the southern accounts. We have 3 dead. 2 warehouses are burning. With the visible, agonizing effort, Dante straightened up. The softness evaporated. The man in command had returned, but now he wore the faint trace of her on his skin. He walked to the door, then stopped, looking back. His hand closed over the rosary on the sink. He didn't put it in his pocket. Instead, he pressed the heavy onyx beads into her palm. They were still warm from his body. Keep this, he commanded. She looked down at the black beads cradled between their hands. Why? His gaze remained locked on hers. Because if they breach this room, I want something of mine to already be in your hand. He was gone before she could form a reply. In the hallway, men were moving with a new, lethal sense of purpose. The conflict had begun. Chapter 7. The train station. A tangible opportunity for escape had finally presented itself. The reality of a family war, she was discovering, held none of the cinematic honor. It was the sound of 3 phones ringing simultaneously in the middle of the night. It was Teresa, unconscious in a chair with a rosary wound tightly around her wrist, a bizarre fusion of piety and battlefield command. It was Matteo, with a smudge on his cuff whose color and story seemed to shift with each passing hour. It was Paolo, attempting to charm Mia while she extracted a bullet from his arm, the man vowing to sue God for unsafe working conditions. And it was her, standing in the warehouse kitchen at 4 a.m, boiling water for coffee while trying with all her might to tune out the sound of men in the next room counting their dead. By the 3rd day, Dante was less a person and more a kinetic force, a shadow moving through corridors powered by a deficit of sleep and a surplus of commands. He consumed almost nothing. He spoke only in terse directives. The only instances of physical contact were accidental, brief brushes in a hallway that felt, somehow, entirely intentional. The rosary he had given her became a permanent resident of her coat pocket. She convinced herself she kept the rosary to steady her own hands. That was only a partial truth. On the 4th night, Paolo intercepted a bullet intended for Matteo. It took place on the lower loading bay, where a delivery truck had feigned its way past the main gate. She heard the report of gunfire from the stairwell and was already in motion before anyone could intervene. By the time she reached the concrete floor, Mia was already there, applying pressure to Paolo's side as he became progressively paler and more dramatic. "Inform my mother," he wheezed, "that I was magnificent." "You are alive," Mia retorted. "For now." Blood was blooming between her fingers. His eyes sought out the patient. "Ah, signora, excellent. If I lose a kidney, inform everyone it was in the defense of a priceless work of art." "You despise art," Matteo grumbled, his rifle still at the ready nearby. Paolo winced in pain. "I respect expensive paper that evokes emotions in people." A shift in his expression revealed the pain had finally pierced his theatrical facade. She knelt on his other side, applying a compress where Mia indicated. Paolo's hand seized hers, his grip tight enough to be painful. She found the pain grounding, a useful anchor when terror threatens to pull you away. "You are not permitted to die," she instructed him. He blinked, the bravado gone, replaced by a profound seriousness. "Not until I've had dinner with Mia." Mia's head snapped up. Paolo managed a choked laugh. "You see, hope." He was carried upstairs, still breathing. The blood remained beneath the patient's fingernails for the rest of the day. That evening, Mia found her on a rear stairwell, looking worn out and marked with the dark stain of Paolo's blood on her shoe. "You can still leave," she offered, her voice hushed. The patient remained silent. Mia pressed a passport and a train ticket into her hand. "My name, my maiden name, Bellini." "Dante is unaware of it," she whispered. "Teresa knows. Matteo will take you to Union Station if I tell him it's a medical transport. A train departs for the east at 9:40. From there, you have a contact in Philadelphia, and then you are gone." The air on the landing felt thin, depleted. "You're arranging my escape?" "I am arranging for you to have a choice while the option still exists." Below them, a door slammed. The sharp sound of men speaking over radios. Somewhere within the compound, Dante's voice sliced through the chaos. A crisp command in Italian that silenced 3 other men instantly. Mia leaned closer. "Elena, you need to hear me. He will perish protecting you, but that is not the same as providing you with a life." The patient looked down at the passport. Bellini, the ghost of a woman she had not yet become. "What will happen to Paolo?" she asked. "He will survive, so long as I maintain my professional disdain for him." The attempt at humor felt hollow in the charged atmosphere. Mia's expression softened. "You are not a captive here, do you understand that? If you stay, it must be an acceptance of what this world is. Not because his intensity has blinded you to what this world will do to you." By 9:30, she was on the station platform. Matteo was positioned 6 feet away, his civilian attire failing to conceal the coiled tension beneath. He had not asked a single question. This silence, more than any words could, confirmed Dante had not sanctioned this departure. Matteo's loyalty was too absolute to allow for an improvised betrayal born of mere compassion. The air carried the scents of diesel fuel, damp concrete, and old pretzels. Families gathered around their luggage. A small girl in a yellow coat was pulling a stuffed rabbit by its ear. No one noticed the patient. This was supposed to feel like liberation. Instead, it felt like observing another person's life from a vast, unbridgeable distance. Her bag contained her father's tools, the prayer book, the ledger, and a cream-colored envelope she had been carrying for months, unopened because she was already certain of its contents. It was a fellowship, the Vatican Conservation School in Rome. This was the blueprint of a life before Dante, before a marriage contract became a security protocol, before she understood her own primal need for fortification and safety. She finally unfolded the letter on the train platform. Acceptance, lodging, a commencement date. It was an entire future that smelled not of locked steel and armed men, but of ancient parchment and sunlight. She read it once, folded it with the precision of a cartographer, and then tore it in half, and then into quarters. The act wasn't a rejection of Rome. It was a concession that Rome was meant for a different girl, a version of herself who believed you could simply outrun a threat until it ceased to exist. Riccardo would still possess the names, Dante would still be prosecuting his war, and Paolo would still be bleeding out on the floor above. She understood that for the rest of her days, she would question whether abandoning that life was an act of self-preservation, or if it was merely cowardice disguised as strength. The train's headlight cut through the gloom, a single piercing eye rounding the bend. Matteo drew nearer. "You get on," he uttered, his voice a near whisper, "and I will ensure no one follows." She held his gaze. "Do you think I should go?" An expression she could not decipher, perhaps pity or simple. Profound weariness passed over his features. "I think," he said, "that this world annihilates women who expect men to be gentler than their design." The train's roar intensified, the sound becoming a physical pressure. It should have been the final impetus. Instead, her hand slipped into her coat, fingers finding the rosary beads Dante had given her after the initial attack. The warmth had vanished now, a phantom heat she could only recall. Yet her fingers retained the memory of each bead's form, the ghost of a touch, not the thing itself. It was enough. She turned her back on the train. Matteo exhaled sharply through his nose. "You are certain?" "No," a tremor shaking her voice. "But I am going back." The gravity of the choice settled on her instantly. Rome was forfeit. The woman named Bellini would never come into being. Whatever innocence she possessed was no longer a matter of circumstance, but a conscious choice she had just made. This was something else, heavier, far more real. When she re-entered the warehouse near 10:30, Teresa saw her face and, without a word, drew her into an embrace. The patient allowed herself to be held for precisely 3 seconds before she stepped away, knowing that any more would cause her to shatter. Dante stood within the operations room, a figure sculpted from the gloom between tactical maps and dark screens. He registered her entrance the moment it happened. His eyes dropped to the bag on her shoulder, then to the train ticket crumpled in her hand, before locking back onto her face. There was no relief in his expression, no flicker of anger. There was only a stillness so profound it felt like a barometric shift in the room. "You left," he stated, the words falling with the weight of stones. "I had a way out." "And?" She crossed the floor, a deliberate act of closing the distance, making it clear this was a transaction meant for him alone. "I came back." Silence commanded the space. Dante's knuckles turned white where he gripped the table's edge. The rosary was gone from its hook. She had it. His gaze fell once to her pocket, a flash of absolute certainty. He gave a curt nod toward the maps. Good. Just that. Before his men, only that one solitary word. But as she turned toward the stairs, she felt his gaze on her back, a searing contact from a hand he would never permit himself to use. She had been offered an escape. She had walked willingly back into the cage. Chapter 8. The Service Lift. The man tasked with guarding her selected the wrong floor. 2 days later, the fatal error was her own. She had begun to believe that by choosing to remain, she had somehow earned a measure of freedom within the grounds. It was vanity, masquerading as utility. A war rewards neither for very long. Dante had already relocated the ledger's copy. Twice. The original, the vellum artifact itself, was secured in a bank vault that only he and Matteo could access. The city was in spasm. Ricardo's crews were striking the south docks and the west route. A classic pincer strategy designed to expose weaknesses, to test how quickly the law would hemorrhage. Every transmission that crackled over the radio brought news of another body, another asset lost, making the air in the room thick with a slow burning dread. She felt the impulse to do something, to act. It was a useless desire, an ambition with no knowledge to support it. At noon, Matteo entered. The request felt dissonant, wrong from its inception. "We need the text from the prayer book, enhanced. The boss wants a clean copy before evening." She failed to see the portents. The unnerving quiet of Dante's absence, the fact Matteo was not wearing a radio, the placid cast of his face, the dead calm of a man on the verge of committing a mortal sin. But she complied, removing the rosary from her pocket and following Matteo to the service elevator. The sound of the door's sealing was a heavy, metallic finality. She watched his hand on the control panel and saw the first tangible sign of the abyss. He pressed B3. The archives were on B2. She felt the shift in her own heart rate. A single sharp staccato of dread. A wrong floor. Matteo's hand did not move. The universe contracted to the dimensions of that steel box. No weapon was necessary. The betrayal itself was a clean, perfect thing, made manifest in his absolute refusal to meet her eyes. "Why?" she asked. As the elevator began its descent, humming its low, mechanical dirge, he offered her the reason. "My daughter," he said. The words took a moment to register. Matteo never spoke of family, a strict, common edict. "Ricardo has her. He's had her for 3 weeks." The words were flat, worn smooth by an unimaginable suffering. He sent photographs, then a finger from her guard to demonstrate his sincerity. The elevator continued to sink. "You sold them routes," she whispered, "delayed them, left gates unguarded. I overlooked things I was paid to observe." "And Lucia?" At the sound of her name, he finally looked at her. His face was not that of a man in defiance, but of a ruined cathedral, somehow still standing. "I wasn't there for that," he said. But I know who was. Ricardo has been using this tactic on fathers for longer than Dante has any idea." The doors slid open onto concrete and deeper darkness. The men waiting were not Ricardo's soldiers. They were contractors, ghosts in ordinary clothes. Gloved hands. One reached for her arm. She moved, a flicker of pure instinct, and drove a microspatula deep into the back of his hand. He cried out. A second man swung, and her vision shattered into a universe of white-hot light. Matteo caught her as she collapsed. "Do not touch her face," he commanded, his voice cracking. "He wants her recognizable." The words exposed the full landscape of Ricardo's pathology. She spit a mixture of blood and saliva onto Matteo's shoe. His eyes shut for a moment. "I deserve worse." "Yes," she breathed, "you do." They proceeded. The location was a decommissioned cold storage facility beneath the warehouse, a tomb of concrete, rust, and the spectral outlines of meat hooks. The room they placed her in once kept flowers chilled for transport. Now it contained only a metal chair, a drain in the concrete, and a single fluorescent tube that washed skin in the pallor of decay. Ricardo arrived an hour later. He had the lethal grace of a beautifully maintained weapon. Silver hair, a dark navy overcoat, and gloves that suggested a wealth untouched by manual labor. She had seen him twice before. On those occasions he had feigned the gentleman, even speaking of his rival, Dante, with the pride a man takes in a prized and dangerous animal. He wore that same smile now. "Elena Bellini," he said, "you possess your father's eyes." That same expression of profound disappointment, as though the entire world is a poorly curated archive. She remained silent. He pulled a chair to sit opposite her. "Dante always did favor the difficult ones, but I am not his." Ricardo's smile changed, acquiring a sharper edge. "Not legally. Paperwork is easily rewritten, not emotionally." He spread his gloved hands in an empty display. "Now that is a far more compelling question." She held his gaze, her only defense against the force of his will. "You sold Lucia," she stated. He tilted his head. "I merely permitted an unfortunate truth to become visible." A chill, clean, and absolute moved through her. She was 16. She was a daughter whose mother was plotting to steal her from this life. He settled into the chair, perfectly at ease. "Love makes a fool of a woman, and then it makes a fool of a man." Sophia wanted an exit. Dante, he still imagines love is an event that befalls you like a house fire. I was simply attempting to teach him that love is leverage. And there it was. Not evil. Something worse. A lecture. A philosophy of power so complete it had become a kind of scripture. "My father discovered it," she said. "He discovered too much, far too late." Ricardo's eyes fell to her pocket. "And now his little girl carries prayer beads into a war room, believing they are a talisman against the fracturing of things." Her hand clenched around the rosary. He saw it. He saw all of it. "Where is the original ledger?" he asked. She gave no answer. He sighed. "Your father concealed secrets in the spines of repaired books because he believed paper possessed more courage than men. He was correct, but paper burns." He rose to depart, and in that moment, Matteo stood in the doorway. Their eyes met. In his, she saw not a plea for absolution, but the raw, gaping wound of grief. "Do not let him harm Teresa," she said. The name was a blade, and it found its mark. She saw him flinch. After Ricardo had gone, she began her breathing exercises, and she took an inventory of her world. One metal chair, a floor drain, one light, a sweating, rusted radiator pipe, and near the floor, a faint residue of paper mulch, a sign, a link back to her own domain. Paper. A ghost of a smile touched her split lip, born from 3 axioms her life's work had taught her. Heat compromises old adhesive, humidity dissolves cardboard, and men of power will always misjudge a woman they have labeled as fragile. She pulled a piece from her slip, saturated it with the pipe's condensation, and began to pick at an old electrical box with a hairpin and a concealed spatula. If Dante was on his way, she had to manufacture more time. If he was not, she would have to manufacture a miracle. For Dante, Matteo's absence was less a thought and more a corporeal void. By the time the security monitors confirmed Elena's empty room, He could grasp the architecture of the betrayal, though not its soul. He saw the balled-up train ticket and shattered his own hand against the wall. She had returned for him, and he had ushered the wolves into the fold. But to see the rosary missing from its hook sent him to a place far colder than mere panic. She had taken it with her. This meant her fear was great enough to require the only object that felt like his presence, a desperate, damning indicator of a connection he himself had forged in trauma. Chapter 9. The cold room door. He had said her name, and the word itself sounded like a wound. The fluorescent fixture hummed. The pipe wept its moisture. Time lost its linear path. Her work was not that of a scholar in archives, but of a creature gnawing its way out of a snare, relying on the only skills she had ever developed. She worked the plate loose, fashioned the damp cloth into thin strips, and fed the moisture into the junction box until the circuit gave a final screaming protest. The initial spark branded her knuckle. The next one plunged the entire world into an immediate, profound blackness. Shouts erupted from the hallway, the heavy sound of boots, a curse. The handle was twisted only to find the door blocked by the chair she had angled underneath it, and then the wood started to crack under a violent, relentless force. She moved quickly to the opposite wall, the rosary clutched tight in one hand, her father's spatula held like a dagger in the other. The door burst from its frame. The first figure stumbled inside, disoriented. She slashed open his face and ducked, evading his panicked lunge. He only snagged the material of her coat as she fled. The hallway was a frozen passage lined with barren racks. Red emergency lamps cast bloody trails on the floor. And from somewhere high above, the alarms started their shriek. That siren was not for her escape. It was the sound announcing a new ghost. A burst of distant, sharp gunfire gave that ghost a name: Dante. She ran toward the noise, like a moth pulled to the very fire that had scarred it, a survival instinct so warped it could be mistaken for a desire for death. A hand emerged from the darkness, closing on her wrist and forcing her body against the cold cinder block. Matteo. A dark flower of blood bloomed on his shoulder. His breathing was a ragged, shallow rhythm. "Wrong direction," he gasped. "You don't get a say in where I go." "Just listen." His grip loosened slightly. "Ricardo had my daughter moved an hour ago." The illusion of a bargain evaporated. It was never anything but a tether. She simply looked at him, at the ghost he was already turning into. He pushed a key card, its plastic cold and definite, into her hand. "West Freezer Gate, down the hall. It opens to the loading ramp. Paolo's crew is there." "And Dante?" His focus seemed to drift beyond her, drawn to the orchestration of the firefight. "He's going after Ricardo." "Alone." The word implied that the part of Dante calibrated for self-preservation had finally been severed by this confrontation. She was being given a real chance at freedom, an open exit, a path away. Instead, she found herself asking, where? A single, fractured laugh broke from Matteo's lips. "You actually came back for him." "I came back with my eyes open." He offered a slow nod, as if acknowledging a premise that was both magnificent and utterly mad. He handed his service pistol to her, a baton changing hands in a deadly relay race. He managed 2 steps before a shot tore through the corridor, striking him in the chest and slamming him back into the wall. The expression on his face was one of pure, almost childlike shock. She felt the concrete next to him. Blood welled in his mouth, silencing his words. "My daughter," he struggled to articulate. We will find her. He moved his head once from side to side, a slow and clear refusal. He pushed the keycard toward her again, a gesture rejecting any attempt at comfort. His fingers found the fabric of her sleeve, clenching. "Tell Dante," he whispered, "I was weaker." It was a final confession, a last point of contrast, just before the light behind his eyes was extinguished. She left him in that place. The living cannot afford to mourn the dead. The corridor gave way to the main storage depot, where the massive doors of the cold rooms hung open on their hinges, like shattered jaws. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes, creating a fog around the men moving through the destruction. One corpse belonged to a contractor from Ricardo's circle. Another was in the uniform of Dante's security team. She stepped past both, discovering Paolo taking cover behind a loading pallet. His face was pale, but his voice was intact. "Ah," he said upon seeing her. "The prodigal wife has returned. Mia is going to owe me $50. I bet on you stabbing someone before you broke down. You're meant to be in a sick bed. I'm in medicine now. Call this field work." His gaze followed the gun she held, a hint of pride at war with a profound, fatherly fear. A short distance away, Mia was on one knee, slamming a fresh magazine into her firearm with a terrifying and fluid grace. A surge of relief washed over her features, so intense it almost looked like an expression of agony. "You have a head wound. Not enough to be significant, which saying it probably indicates a concussion." A loud, percussive impact echoed from the office hallway, beyond the line of freezers. It wasn't falling debris. It was something heavy, intentional. Dante. Paolo read the understanding in her expression and swore. "No, not a chance. If you move toward him, I'm going to have a fatal heart attack right on this spot. I need the building plans or a schematic." Mia was now just watching. "Elena, I know this kind of layout," I said, speaking quickly. "Church annexes, shipping basements, floral warehouses, they are all built on the same skeleton. If Ricardo has the office wing sealed, there will be a secondary service corridor for air circulation that runs behind the line of dead boxes." Paolo simply stared. "I've never been so aroused by building codes." I took the chalk marker from the pallet and drew the probable hallway on the concrete floor. The access panel accepted Matteo's keycard precisely where I had marked an X. Paolo's gaze shifted from the drawing to my face, his sarcastic armor falling away. "You can actually lead us there." "Yes." Mia's hand gripped my arm, halting my movement. "If you enter that room, you are going to witness something you can never erase." I recalled the study, the blood, and his eyes seeking mine out first, just to confirm I was alive, and how he had stopped after kissing me, because fear was a more powerful drive than desire. "I know," I said. We began to move. The service corridor was a narrow metal gullet lined with coolant lines that wept cold condensation down on us. It terminated at an office defined by a single splintered doorframe. Inside, a desk lay on its side, and Riccardo Viscardi was on his knees. Dante's hand was coiled around his throat. For one impossible, suspended second, I was not there. Dante's back was turned to me, his firearm was on the ground. Blood matted the hair at his temple and stained his shirt cuffs. Ricardo smiled up at him through the hold, like a man greeting a destiny he had long awaited. "Do it," Ricardo rasped. "Become what I am." And in that moment, Dante heard me inhale. He turned. Some moments do not define a life with a loud report, but with the quiet drawing of a breath. Dante seeing me alive was just such a moment, his entire presence reconfigured in a single, silent beat. The homicidal tranquility, the jolt of relief, the volcanic anger, the disbelief. It was a tempest too large for a single expression to contain. His hold on Ricardo went slack, a critical hesitation that gave Paolo the opening to tackle the older man with a grunt that suggested heroism was physically demanding. Dante covered the distance to me in 2 steps. He did not ask if I was injured. He could see it, the split lip, the torn clothing, the bruises that were already starting to surface. He cupped my face in his hands, a touch so deliberate it felt as if it might break me. Elena. He spoke my name as if he were mapping the perimeter of a wound. I reached up and touched the blood near his temple. Matteo's dead. The words found their mark. I watched them hit, a flinch so profound it appeared as absolute stillness. He gave me this, I said, showing him the key card. And the way out? Dante shut his eyes for the space of a single respiration in and then out. He then pressed his forehead against mine, a raw gesture that was not about intimacy, but about survival. In the background, Paolo's voice could be heard demanding emotional hazard pay if anyone began exchanging vows while he was in the middle of an assault. Ricardo let out a strangled laugh. You see, this is how love erodes discipline. Dante's entire bearing shifted. He straightened up, and a serenity settled over him that I recognized from the stories as the prelude to his most efficient and final acts of violence. That someone in this room was soon to die was a fact we all held in unspoken agreement. Ricardo was aware of it. He continued to smile. A mental note. Chapter 10. The River House. The man he had killed was like a father to him. Ricardo was permitted to remain alive for exactly 43 minutes. Just long enough for the warehouse to be secured. Long enough for Mia to coerce Paolo onto a stretcher while he protested that lying down made him appear shorter. It was enough time for Teresa to show up, notice the blood on my coat, and murmur a prayer that sounded remarkably like a threat. Long enough for Dante, standing inside a freight elevator with a handcuffed Ricardo, to reach a state of stillness so complete that each breath felt like a measured, rationed act. Ricardo's laugh about Matteo's death was what brought the 43 minutes to an end. It was never Lucia's betrayal, nor the years of skimming, not even the abduction itself. Matteo, whatever his failings, died attempting to restore a kind of balance. And Ricardo's mockery of that final act was a desecration Dante heard with his soul. Take him to the river house, Dante ordered, his voice leaving no room for dissent. The river house. It waited at the southern boundary of Salvatore territory, where the city dissolves into industrial decay and inherited wealth conceals its transgressions behind ivy and weeping willows. His grandfather's house, men still spoke of it in hushed tones, which was everything one needed to know. Sophia went, despite Dante's command. I am ending this tonight, he stated in the armored vehicle, one hand anchored to the seat ahead. Dried blood formed a dark map at his temple, a wound he refused to let Mia treat. So am I, she replied. This is not your work. That man had my father killed, sold your sister, and had me caged like an animal. Her voice was a fragile layer of ice over a churning abyss. Do not presume to tell me where my own life ends. He regarded her for a long, unreadable moment before offering a single sharp nod. It was at once permission, surrender, and a form of respect. 3 concepts that in his world often bled into one. At the river house, the atmosphere was thick with the taste of lake silt, antiquated lemon polish, and the lingering residue of old suffering. The upstairs study was a museum of dead things on its walls and a fireplace that stood cold and waiting. Ricardo was bound to a chair at the center of the room, an honored guest who had fatally overstayed his welcome. Mateo's second vial lay on the desk, a silent companion to Dante's pistol, and in that moment she finally understood. This was not a theater for torture. This was an audit. He interrogated Ricardo with the same brutal efficiency he applied to violence. No superfluous motion, no wasted words. Dates, names, shipping routes, bank accounts, which officer was on the payroll, which customs official, which family member. Ricardo answered some questions, for hubris always demands an audience. He lied about others because the chains of habit are stronger than the will to survive. She stood by the desk, cross-referencing his statements against her father's ledger, making silent amendments, her focus tracing the phantom architecture of numbers he had taught her to perceive. This was her role in the final scene, not as a prize, not as a casualty, but as the final verifier. When Ricardo denied the Vatican account, she placed the prayer book on the desk, opening it to the pages where the numbers were embossed into the paper like old scars. "You pressed too hard just here," she informed him. "My father suspected something was amiss because you funneled church restoration funds to conceal it. A genuine conservator would never abbreviate pigment orders in that manner." For the first time, Ricardo's gaze held a flicker of genuine intellectual curiosity. "Carlo taught you well. He taught me what was necessary." And Dante's eyes shifted to her. Pride. It was a brief, dangerous spark in the suffocating darkness. Ricardo saw it, too. He was a creature who would never miss such a tell. "That is your fundamental weakness," he whispered to Dante. "It is not love. It's recognition. You need her to witness the man behind the violence, and that makes you hesitant." "And you?" Dante countered. "What shaped you?" Ricardo strained against his bonds, testing their strength. "Precision." "No," Dante stated, his tone devoid of emotion. "It was cowardice, given a fine suit and taught table manners." The silence that descended was heavy enough to steal the air from the room. And then Ricardo did precisely what a psychopath does when he has proven his point. He made it personal because the intellectual victory was no longer enough. "Your mother begged," he said. It was quite unpleasant. "But Lucia? She simply stared at me, as if I had disappointed her." "The way your wife looks at you now." Dante moved. He crossed the room with such velocity that the chair was already tipping before the mind could process the motion. His hand clamped onto Ricardo's throat like a vice, wrenching him partially upright as the floorboards shrieked under the chair's weight. For one terrible, suspended moment, she saw the future Ricardo had meticulously designed. Dante, reduced to a pure instrument of blind, annihilating rage, every vestige of his humanity incinerated. "Dante," she said. Just his name. It was the only tool she possessed. He froze, not from any mystical hold she had over him, but because somewhere within that maelstrom of fury, enough of the man remained to recognize her voice. His grip slackened imperceptibly. Ricardo smiled, blood blossoming around his teeth. "There! That is it! That hesitation. Sophia would have despised what you've become, but this she would despise even more." Dante released him. He retreated to the desk, took the duplicate ledger and extended it to her. "Read the last line." She looked down. Her father's script, a perfect mirror of his own, a payment ledger, a route authorization, and one final annotation, a detail she had missed in her initial frantic attempt at decryption. "If this is discovered after my death, Sofia Salvatore was attempting to escape with this proof. Biscardi started the fire. Do not let Dante become the evidence of him." A knot of ice crystallized in her chest. She raised her head. Dante witnessed the truth fracturing across her face before she could articulate it. That was all that was needed. Something inside him shifted, not a softening, but a snapping into a terrible final clarity. He looked at Ricardo as though he could at last perceive the true magnitude of the man's debt. He did not use his hands for the killing. He used the penknife from her kit, her father's knife. Bone handle, the blade thin and precise, designed for lifting ancient leather and scraping away old glue. This was not a weapon of glory. It was a tool for making a clean separation. Dante used it to sever Ricardo's restraints. A single choked laugh escaped Ricardo's lips. Dante set the blade on the desk, pushed the evidence file toward him, and pressed record on Matteo's recovered phone. "You will provide me with a signed confession," he said, his voice perfectly even, "naming every corrupt official, every route you compromised." A pause. "Then you will repeat it all for this recording." Ricardo's expression was a void. "And if I refuse?" "Then you will receive a bullet in the mouth, and I will release the ledgers regardless." All the man's swagger simply dissolved. The entire procedure took 11 minutes. He signed, clinging to the old underworld assumption that their world would sooner bury a scandal than confront a truth. He talked because Dante enumerated, one by one, which of his offshore accounts had already vanished and which of his mistresses were now under federal surveillance. A threat of perfect symmetry, a mirroring of logic. When it was finished, Dante fired a single, clean shot through his heart. No final words, no theatrics. Just a quiet efficiency more chilling than any scream of rage could ever be. Ricardo collapsed to the floor and was still. She forced herself to watch. It was a deliberate choice. Later, with the body removed and the file replicated and dispatched to 3 rival organizations who would ensure its dissemination, they were alone. Dawn was beginning to fracture the darkness beyond the study windows. "He transformed you into something else," she said. Dante's eyes were locked on the blood seeping into the rug. "He did. And now?" His gaze rose to meet hers, then drifted to the prayer book still open on the desk and to her father's knife beside it. She was confronting a choice about her own soul. The cost of that choice was inscribed all around them. Matteo was dead. Paolo was wounded. Lucia remained lost. The very concept of innocence, his or hers, had ceased to be even a memory. But a cycle had been broken. Teresa called shortly after sunrise. Paolo was conscious and making demands for both food and praise. Mia had collapsed, but only after she was alone with Teresa. The bond officials were already betraying one another in predictable frenzy for self-preservation. Dante took the call, listened, and then exhaled a long, slow breath. The sound of a man relinquishing a weapon he had held for a lifetime. He looked at her across the ruined room and uttered the only thing that held any meaning after such a night. "The worst is over." Chapter 11. The Kitchen Table. His question was not a simple one. It could not be. The end of a war is never a clean affair. There are bodies to be interred. debts to be settled. 2 police captains resigned, citing health reasons, the classic Chicago euphemism for terror. The newspapers spoke of financial malfeasance and a tragic industrial fire. Lucia's name was never mentioned, nor was her father's. Dante had them etched in stone regardless. Lucia's name was mounted in the family chapel. Carlo Bellini's was installed in the side garden of St. Cecilia's, in a corner where paper flowers from forgotten services tended to gather against the fence. Paolo treated his own survival as a personal victory over mortality itself. "I had a near-death experience," he announced 3 weeks later, seated in the newly renovated Salvatore house kitchen. "If Mia continues to reject me, I may be forced to cultivate a personality." Mia scoffed from her position at the stove. "Start with your medication." Teresa tapped his shoulder with a spoon, and Zeus flexing at the soup. "I'm not flexing. This is grief, manifesting as my pectoral muscles." She laughed so profoundly she had to lean over the table. This, one suspects, is how healing truly begins. Not in quiet contemplation, but with the absurd slowly reclaiming territory shattered by trauma. She had not returned to Dante's bedroom. This appeared to stun everyone except Teresa, who possessed the wisdom to feign ignorance. They coexisted in the house under a quiet, intentional truce, while she maintained her own suite in the East Wing with a private workshop near the library. In that space, the morning light cast clean lines across the conservation table Dante had constructed for her from reclaimed walnut and steel. He had done it without being asked. She termed it an act of tyranny. He countered that the drawers were lined with suede to cushion her beautiful suffering. They were learning to interpret one another in these small gestures now. The way he drank coffee only after sunrise, and only if she prepared it. The way her speech quickened when she was afraid, and her profound silence after the damage was complete. One observes the way his hand would hover in the space behind her back, a gesture suspended in the crowded air, promising proximity without contact, or how specific sounds could still fracture her sleep. And on the nights she sought the chapel garden over her bed, he never feigned ignorance. The rosary had evolved into a silent lexicon between them, a system of meaning that required no discussion. He might be holding it in meetings, the beads clicking softly against his knuckles, an echo of the sound she first heard outside his study, armed with only a tray and a sliver of hope. At other times, seeing her stare too long at a scorched manuscript, he would place the beads beside her lamp and vanish, a tacit offering of borrowed fortitude. During one rainy afternoon, Paolo entered her workshop, his exaggerated limp a piece of theater, carrying a bakery box like a courier with classified documents. "I bring cannoli and intelligence." Which is the more dependable? "The cannoli, I suspect." He sat, uninvited, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "You're aware he's kept the ring in his desk this entire time, correct?" Her hand froze over the page she was restoring. "What ring?" Paolo's stare was unwavering. "Elena." He exhaled a long, theatrical sigh. "If I'm forced to narrate the plot of your own tragedy, I will be invoicing you." A wave of heat crept up her neck. "You're insufferable." "But accurate?" He leaned in. "Also, if you shatter his heart at this stage, Mia has informed me that while she champions both women's rights and women's wrongs, I'll be managing the consequences. So, strategize accordingly." She threw a wadded piece of tissue at him. He caught it effortlessly, as if it were a projectile, his face a mask of wounded dignity. Later, Dante found her in the dim light of the kitchen, A child's missile lay dismantled before her. Teresa had discovered it, a forgotten artifact from storage, its edges blackened and made brittle by the chapel fire. Pages were fused by smoke. Outside, rain carved long, weeping trails down the window panes, the scent of garlic and basil. The culinary ghosts of Teresa's dinner lent the space a fragile human warmth. He placed 2 cups of tea on the table, the ceramic a whisper against the wood, and hesitated for a moment too long, a man silently rehearsing a pivotal line. Paolo has spoken to you. It is his pattern. About the ring. She looked up from the burned page. He did not evade the topic. She had learned his honesty, now arrived faster, with cruelty no longer his primary rhetorical tool. Not with less pain, just more speed. Yes, was her only reply. His hand delved into his pocket and re-emerged, setting the ring on the table. It rested between them, her wedding band. A simple gold circle. Its diminutive size was a stark contradiction to the sheer magnitude of the devastation it had outlasted. I kept it, he stated. I know it should have been presented the moment you returned. A just assessment. A single, sharp nod. He conceded the point, then occupied the chair opposite her. His forearms settled on the scarred wood, a surface that held the history of Teresa's flower, Paolo's misery, and the place where she had, against all odds, constructed a life. This will not be a storybook ending, he said, his voice quiet. A smile nearly formed on her lips. Good. I have never excelled at playing the princess. A warmth lit his eyes, a scarce and delicate light, visible only because she understood the profound darkness it had cost to kindle it. No, you are not. The rain intensified its assault on the windows. His gaze lowered to the broken missal. Its charred leather was propped open by weights, the frail pages separated with blotting paper. You are saving it, he noted, a declaration. I am stabilizing it, she corrected him. Saving is a later stage. Is there a distinction? Yes. Her bone folder smoothed a crease from a smoke-warped page. Stabilizing is to prevent further deterioration on my watch. Saving is when it can be held again. Without fear. A dense quiet filled the space between them. And then, with his characteristic, terrifying efficiency, he traversed an entire chasm of their unspoken past with one request. Teach me the second part. She observed him for a long, quiet interval. This man, this violent, controlled, impossible man, had once stood in a cold room declaring he felt nothing for her. And now he sat in a warm kitchen asking not for pardon, not for passion, but for instruction on how to preserve something precious. Her throat tightened. What, exactly, are you asking, Dante? He reached forward, his thumb and forefinger closing on the ring, rotating it once. In his other hand, the rosary beads made a sound like chattering teeth. I am asking, he said, if you will marry me now, not to honor your father's contract, not for the protection my name affords, but because I have performed the calculus on the cost of losing you, little saint, and I wish to live the remainder of my days in open acknowledgement of that sum. There it was, not poetry, not a romantic appeal, just the truth, unvarnished and heavy with its own history. The burn behind her eyes was instantaneous, a mortifying but unavoidable physiological reaction. He didn't move. He made no gesture to comfort her. He simply sat, contained within his dangerous patience, and allowed the moment to land with its full, brutal gravity. Yes, She finally managed to breathe. But if you ever address me with the tone you used that night in the study, I will take half your art and all of your coffee. A faint smile brushed his lips. Extortion is a good look for you. He moved then, rounding the table with a slowness that was both a question and an offered escape. She did not take it. He slid the ring onto her finger with the same hands that had dispensed both death and protection. And his kiss was warm, and it was settled, and it was real. No frantic motion, no fear disguised as passion. From the doorway, Paolo whispered, "If anyone needs me, I'll be in the hall, weeping for clinical reasons." They heard Mia dragging him away by his collar. Dante rested his forehead on hers. The kitchen was bright. The rain on the glass was a constant rhythmic beat. The house never recovered its innocence, and neither did they. But when he said, "Come to bed when you are done, little saint," the words were not a command to be defied. They were simply the geography of a place where she belonged. Chapter 12, The Strip of Linen. He recognized the repeating pattern, and this time he named it. 10 months on, the first sound she heard was the rosary. Click, click, not from beyond a locked door, but here, next to her own work table. Afternoon light cut across repaired books, sharp instruments, and a bowl of lemon peels. Teresa swore would combat the room's scent of scholarly melancholy. The new Bellini Salvatore Conservation Wing now filled the renovated carriage house. It was an archive, a workshop, financed with capital Dante had once earmarked for less pious ventures, now redirected to his eternal frustration, into preserving the frayed histories of the church and its flock. Documents and histories, items people deem worthless until a fire or flood threatens their existence. She was examining a water-damaged marriage ledger from 1924 when Dante entered, foregoing the formality of a knock. Certain hierarchies never dissolve. Love does not abolish authority, it merely redraws its borders. He had lost his jacket somewhere between the main house and here. His cuffs were folded back once, tie loosened, hair disheveled by the wind. A fine, clean line of red marked one knuckle, an injury probably sustained on a crate latch he had insisted on moving himself, as the act of delegation seems an offense to his very nature. The prayer beads made a single sharp sound against his ring as he registered her glance. She set the ledger down. "What were you fighting with?" "A box." Did the box prevail? His mouth nearly formed a smile, a brief twitch of muscle and memory. The expression remained jarring, not because of its current rarity, but because she recalled a time it was completely absent. She moved around the table, taking his hand to inspect it under the lamplight. The cut was just as she expected. Clean, shallow, a physiological postscript. She didn't ask for permission. This has always been their dynamic, from the beginning until now. She took a roll of linen from her apron and wrapped the cut, an action focused on the injury itself, setting aside the man, the weapon that forged him, and the brutal world he ruled, which once taught him that tenderness was a fatal vulnerability. His gaze remained fixed on her face the whole time. Outside, a procession of children from the parish school wound through the chapel gardens. Their high-pitched voices carried on the air, a sound still pure and unfamiliar with calculated fear. From inside the house, Paolo's voice rose, complaining that fatherhood had not improved his physique. Mia, now his wife in a development that defied all reason, told him to hold their baby for his workout. Teresa's laugh followed. The sound, though distant, altered the atmosphere in the room. As she secured the knot, Dante's fingers enclosed her hand. "There," she said. "You'll survive." "I know." He did not release her. His eyes darkened in that familiar way, no longer with menace, but with the terrifying consuming focus that made her feel both entirely seen and completely possessed. I recognized that expression. It was still capable of unsettling me. Perhaps it always would. Perhaps certain kinds of love require a sliver of darkness to feel authentic. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He exhaled once, a sharp sound through his nose. The beads made a soft, clicking noise. "Do you have any comprehension, hint?" he began, "of what you did to me that first night?" A small, breathless laugh escaped me. "Force you into a marriage?" His thumb moved, tracing a slow arc over the pulse point at my wrist. "No." His voice deepened, transforming into something else entirely. "In the study," he said, "with blood on my hands, a man dying on my rug. You should have been terrified of me. You should have fled, but you didn't. You reached for the injury." I could feel that night again. The bitter coffee, the smell of blood and cedarwood, the single phrase that undid me, and the heavy door I secured behind me, because staying would have meant my own erasure. "You recognized that before I did," I murmured. "I recognized it before I understood the wound was mortal." A smile touched my lips despite the constriction in my throat. "Mortal?" "Yes." His gaze held mine, steady and absolute. "You made me a person in a room where, for years, I had only existed as an object of fear. Do you understand the cost of that?" I saw Lucia, Sophia, Ricardo, Matteo, the river, the station, the kitchen table. I saw every iteration of him. The man balanced on the razor's edge between a weapon and a human, who chose repeatedly to be both, refusing to let one annihilate the other. "It cost you the armor you wore to pretend you were self-sufficient," I said. A slow warmth spread over his features, not surprise, but the deep contentment of being completely seen. "Yes, little saint." He spoke it one final time, the name now gentle, carrying the weight of our entire history. He lifted my hand and pressed his lips to the fine dust of linen on my knuckles. Then he took the rosary from his pocket, placing it on the table that separated us. Black beads against pale wood,